I sort of start before I really know if that's where I should be. And this one, we were, I'll talk a little bit about the sponsor of the research, but essentially the first part of the research was simply finding out what the literature had to say about how farmers make decisions about conservation practices, as well as enrollment in conservation programs. So we wrote a couple of papers on that and we looked at it. I just want to go through what it looked like, the literature, because it pretty much guided the research, and I think it should. The first part is how these different studies looked at what farmers and ranchers and others think about conservation programs and practices. And a lot of them did surveys, and by surveys I just mean they asked them, what do you think? And I'll talk a little bit about that, but that has some obvious downfalls, because if you ask farmers, for example, is conservation important? Most of them said yes. Things like that. People tend to answer more positively. They did interviews. They also use secondary data to talk, for example, about the role of the conservation program on farmland prices and on commodity prices and so on. And economists have, over the last 20 years, moved towards hypothetical choice sets and other sort of experimental things where you force the individual into a choice. And I'm going to talk in more detail about that because that's what we did. The two models that most of the literature use are the rational economic man model, which is, as economists, we assume that people are profit maximizing, knowing that, of course, they're not profit maximizing and they don't have full information and so on. The second body of literature focused most on not only economics, but other things that influence conservation. And we'll talk about what those things are. So what we learned from the literature, which was important things that I think I didn't really know, is the first one, and that's the only one I'm going to talk about in any detail, is the decision-making process, be it a farmer or anybody else, is influenced by other people. And I want to give you an example here. Both my children are here, so right now, but this is an example. If you ask me what kind of pizza do you want, or I were to go and order a pizza, I would order a pizza with everything on it, with the exception of olives. For some reason, I don't like olives, but all the vegetables and all the fruit. I really like a top-heavy pizza. But when I go to the store to buy a pizza, I often, especially when the children were young, I just bought cheese pizza. And so my utility, what's important to me, what I value is not what I actually purchase, because it has to filter through somebody who doesn't like meat, and it has to filter through another family member who doesn't prefer vegetables. So what often happens is if you ask people what they want, you get a different answer than you would get if you observe them purchasing something or enrolling in a contract. So it was really important to learn that lesson. And most farmers are male, but most farms are not necessarily run by men. They're run by a team, a spousal team. And often if the farmer of record is a male, the wife has plenty to say about how things are run and so on. So it's a decision-making process that not only includes the input of others, but includes a discussion and compromise and so on. We also, I talked a minute ago about response limitations. People may say things that are not necessarily true. We had a lot of problems deciding what variables to include and exclude, and I'm going to show you that. Barriers to adoption, you may need to explicitly ask people, because sometimes a program looks good, it's something they're interested in, but they simply won't enroll for some particular reason. So often when we do this research, a question we ask is there anything that you can see that would stop you from doing this? And you often get a lot of information. Specific to conservation, it's a joint decision. You're deciding how a farm is operating. You're not deciding whether to enroll in a working lands program, but you're deciding how the overall farm is operating, and that will be a component. So the decision about a conservation practice or a conservation program is dependent on what the rest of the farm looks like and what they're doing. So we looked at some of these things, and the important thing from the literature is that there's a lot of things that you need to understand about how people make decisions and what sort of things influence farming. From an investigative standpoint, do you all have many? I can't really ask you, but I assume you have statistics classes and so on. They're all nodding their heads.
Yes.
Okay, great. So whether you estimate a model or you try to explain something using a single equation and use variables for differences like farm size, or whether it's a female or a male, or whether they have livestock or not, or whether you need to sort of model them separately, is an important question. So we learned a lot, I guess the bottom line is, from the literature review. Okay, so are there any questions about that? There's not really a lot you can ask, but maybe you'll come up with one. Okay, I'll move right along. So this is what I want to talk about. I'm going to talk about how we did this, and it's more how did it happen. And I think the interesting story, particularly for the second thing I'm going to talk about, is the political process. But we looked only at the Prairie Pothole region. If you're familiar with that, it's part of Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and a little bit of Iowa and the western part of Minnesota. And this is kind of a typical picture of the Prairie Pothole region. It's essentially an area that is denoted by a lot of low-lying areas that are sometimes, this one, of course, they're a little bit larger. These are potholes or swamps or whatever you call them at home. They're a little bit larger. You can see from the size of the farmstead down here, these are pretty large acreages, but a lot of times they're small, and a lot of times they're not, the wetlands are not holding water. They're only identified as wetlands based on the vegetation and so on. So most of the year, or particularly if it's dry, they won't be holding water. So it's really important as an area of particularly for waterfowl and sort of other mostly birds that use this particular area. It's really important for the rest of the United States because this is where they breed. And a lot goes on in this area, and particularly as we've changed to grow soybeans and now corn and so on, volatility in crop prices has increased quite a bit over the last couple of decades. So things have becoming, the opportunity cost and the risk and so on have become a much different story. From a conservation reserves program standpoint, this map right here just shows you the conservation reserve program land. This is for a decade and it's quite old, but this is a 10 to 15 year program. So a lot of the land that is in the conservation reserve program is in the Prairie Pothole region. And I think there would be more if it's limited, with exceptions. You can only have a certain percentage of the land in a county in the conservation reserve program. That was a concession because of course it takes land out of production, which not only makes it more challenging for new farmers and expanding farmers, but of course input suppliers and so on. But it's really, the conservation reserve program is really important in this particular area. And I gave a presentation on this in China, which I tried to explain what the Prairie Pothole region looks like. And this is what I came up with to try to explain, because much of China, where it's rural, it's very mountainous and so on. But we have very flat lands and we have very range of productivity of soils. Okay, so I'm going to move right into one set of research. We did two different studies here, but essentially we looked at how farmers make decisions about whether to enroll in the conservation reserve program in a nutshell. And this gives you an idea here. Again, it's a little bit better picture of the Prairie Pothole region. It shows you recently the number of acres in each county that are enrolled in the conservation reserve program. So it's a very important part of the Prairie Pothole region. It's a voluntary program. And again, I mentioned it's either 10 years under general sign-up, 15 years under continuous sign-ups, and there are other programs that vary now from 3 to 5 to 30 years that are newly introduced. It's environmentally sensitive land that's in production. So you can't just enroll land in the conservation reserve program. It has to be land that you're taking out of production. It has to have been in production the three of the last 5 years. Two things I want to highlight is, as we mentioned earlier, the payment is fixed. You get the payment. It's a bid payment, but people generally bid in their land at near the maximum payment, which is essentially the rental rate. The National Ag Statistics Association puts out county rental rates, and that's usually what it is. And if you opt out, it's really important to understand that you pay everything back. So once you're in the program, it's a pretty serious commitment. The objectives are all environmentally related. They've evolved to include wildlife habitat, and it's based whether or not they take your land, the attractiveness of your land to the program, whether it's valuable to the government to take your land, depends on something called the Environmental Benefits Index. And this has evolved over time. It includes, of course, the effect on water quality and soil quality. It depends on what it is you're going to plant as a cover crop and so on. So that's the Conservation Reserve Program. This is funded research, and the reality is somebody has to fund research. And Delta Waterfall, which if you've heard of Ducks Unlimited, it's a political sister to Ducks Unlimited. Ducks Unlimited works the political system by purchasing land. Is their primary objective is to get land that protects duck habitat. Delta Waterfall works the same objective to protect duck habitat, but they do through trying to influence the policy process. So they came to me and asked me if I would do this work. And their objective was to keep land in CRP, because ducks not only need water, but when they nest out in sort of grassland. So if you have CRP land, that makes excellent land for duck habitat. So in order to get more land in the CRP, the basic economic principle was either you need to make the program more attractive to farmers so they will enroll, or you need to reduce the cost of participation for them, however that may be. So that's the objective I was given. This is what we want to investigate. And so we decided to look at the program because they're policy people. That's what Delta Waterfall does. They go and try to influence policy, and they're very effective at it. So we looked at the particular contract. What is it that the farmer is enrolling in? And we specifically looked at different attributes of the program and tried to identify what's attractive to farmers and what's not attractive to farmers. And we also looked at how that differed between farmers. Does a guy look at the attributes of the farm program the same if he has livestock or not have livestock? And I'll give you an example that's really unique to the CRP. The CRP technically does not allow you to do anything with the land. You can't burn it, as a midterm management to get rid of, for example, weeds tend to grow in CRP land. You can't burn it, you can't graze it, you can't hay it. So livestock people having grassland out there and being unable to graze or hay it is a major disadvantage. And often livestock people need to rent land. So they're not looking for less land, they're looking for more land. Uniquely, very often in the last 15 years, they've been able to graze or hay CRP land under emergency provisions. But the hard and fast rule is you can't. So one of the attributes that we want to look at for CRP is whether being able to hay or graze that land, say after a certain date, would be attractive. In other words, farmers would enroll in that, or ranchers would enroll in that when they would otherwise not. So we did that through choice experiments. Is anybody familiar with choice experiments? I have no way of seeing their answer. Can you answer?
I'm assuming it might be good to go over it.
Okay, so this is essentially, I'm going to talk about choice experiments. I'll explain it a little bit better, but essentially what we're trying to do is figure out, like, this is a CRP contract. So a hypothetical contract. You use choice experiments by asking people, what do you want to buy, or what do you want to enroll in, when you don't really have the product yet. It's not something you can observe. You can go to the store and see if people want pizza with cheese or pizza without cheese, or if they'll pay more for branded milk than non-branded milk, and so on. But if the contract is as it is, in order to test other contracts with different attributes, you have to make it hypothetical. And essentially what a choice experiment does, and I'll describe it in a little more detail, is it defines the contract however it is that you want, whatever the features that are important. For example, in this case, what was important was the payment rate, and that's 100% of the local rental rate. The contract, is it fixed or is it readjusted? And in this case, we had it fixed at a particular payment rate. Or we tried a hypothetical situation where after 5 years, they would readjust it to a new rental rate. And most farmers are very optimistic, and usually land prices tend to increase. So that would be more attractive. The length, we tried different lengths. This right here is an important part of the CRP. It's not a huge monetary outlay by the government, but it's important to the farmer in part because it demonstrates the government's contribution. But when land is put in CRP, you have to plant something. And generally you plant some kind of seed mix that is often quite more expensive than you would otherwise plant. And so this establishment paid is the government's share of the cost of putting in that cover crop. And then grazing or haying, whether it's allowed it or not. So we thought these were the important attributes of the contract from talking with farmers. So we tried different alternatives. And choice experiments, like I said, are really good because it allows you to look at different attributes. What happens if we increase the length by 5 years? What happens if we decrease payment by 20%? So rather than looking at the whole package, you're looking at a part of the package. And in this particular survey, the first one we did, we actually did interviews. We went out and did interviews, but the choice experiment looked at payment levels. It looked at the readjustment. It looked at 2 contract lengths, 2 establishment cost percentage, the part the government's paying, and then either you could graze it or you couldn't. So it's pretty simplistic. And what we ask the people to do and how this is designed is we ask them to rank the contract. And in this case, you'll see that the individual ranked this one number 1. So this contract, that 120% readjusted, shorter contract with less of a government payment to put in the stand and allowing to graze, was most attractive. Since they ranked the third option, which is do not enroll, that means that they would not enroll in this contract. So they would choose this one first. Their second option is not to do anything, which makes this one the least preferred. Okay, that's what they were faced with when we gave them a sheet of paper. They were asked to compare this, and do not enroll. And then they were on to number 2 and so on. And you'll see there's a whole bunch of different combinations of attributes. And what this allows you to do mathematically is sort of discern out how much payment matters and what that fixed term payment fixed at the start versus adjusted midterm, what that's worth to a farmer. And I don't want to talk about the math at all, but there it is if you're interested in doing it. Like many other things nowadays, you don't need to know the math. You just need to know how to work Stata or NLogit or LIMDEP or whatever statistical programming package you're using. All right, so in this first one, which was pretty simplistic, we went ahead and put it in. What we're asking it to do is we're asking it to explain their ranking, which is essentially asking them what is the likelihood that they're going to enroll in a particular contract with different attributes. And this is the kind of output you get. And the numbers are not important. What's important right now is the sign. So what this tells us here is payment has a positive parameter estimate. That means that at a higher payment, if you pay more, they're more likely to enroll. That's good. And then length, if you have a longer contract, they're less likely to enroll. If you have a fixed contract that is not readjusted, they're less likely to enroll because they're putting their land in for 10 years, for example, but they think that prices will go up. And if you require that they have the land remain idle, they're also less likely to enroll versus ability to graze and hay. Okay. Now, if you think about it, letting land remain idle, not grazing or haying it, would be important only to who? And I'm going to assume you all said to livestock owners. So because non-livestock owners, unless they have neighbors that want to rent it, don't need that. So these are interactive terms. And in particular, this one is livestock times remain idle. So this demonstrates that in general, forcing somebody to leave the land completely idle for 10 years makes them less likely to enroll. That's the negative number. That is amplified for people that have livestock. This is a dummy variable, yes, no. So it's that negative utility, the disadvantage of having that land remain idle, is particularly strong for those with livestock. So then we can discern that livestock people look at the Conservation Reserve Program differently than others. And in this particular thing, another thing that was really important, there were a lot of different variables. Age was important. and age is interactive with the attributes as well. So I'll give you one more example. Age times payment. Now remember, payment is positive, higher payment, more likely to enroll. That is not as true when you get older. Older individuals are less responsive to payment, okay? And so on. So the other thing that came up, and there were a lot of different things we tried, were complaints. So in this particular case, we looked at whether individuals had a problem with the CRP as it is currently established, what the contract currently says. And people had different concerns, and I'll show you that. We asked them specifically, it was an open-ended question because it was an interview. Do you see any problems with the current CRP? And you'll see that almost a third of the individuals said the criteria are too specific. That they're don't allow land that should be in the program to be in the program. A lot of farmers had an issue with the administrative process or the officials, and that varied county to county because like any other administrative office, some people are friendly and will help you, and others are maybe less friendly and will help you. The terms of the contract need to be changed. These almost 70% of the people said that the contract payment needs to be adjustable. You can't lock it in for 10 years at one payment. So there's lots of issues that individuals identified. And we found out that the responsiveness of these individuals to payment, or the responsiveness of these individuals to how long the contract was depended in part whether or not they had a complaint in a particular area. And for example, I'll give you more detail later on that, but example, rules complaint. Those who had concerns about the rules of the program were more responsive to payment, and they were more responsive to length and more responsive to the requirement that the land remain idle. In other words, those who didn't like the current rules of the CRP were much more responsive when those rules changed. So that was, to us, that was very interesting because I hadn't thought of it prior. All right, are there any questions? I know that's a lot of information. Okay, this one I just want to show you. I don't want to go over it in great detail. One thing choice experiments do is allow you to look at how changes in an attribute, for example, increasing the length of the program by 1 year, how that changes the likelihood that somebody will enroll in the program. So you can calculate marginal effects, and the numbers are not all that important, but you can see that if you increase the payment by 1%, it increases the likelihood they'll enroll by 0.4%. So they're pretty responsive. So using a choice experiment allows you to look at how changes in the attributes of the program or the individuals or their particular operation will change the likelihood that they will participate. Okay. And you can see here, one I just want to point out, livestock. So if they have livestock, they're 12%, almost 13% less likely to enroll in the program. Okay, so I'll just show you in a nutcase, this is what we found on that, is that payment, contract length, and whether or not you could graze or hay the land was the most important. These are the attributes that were most important. In other words, people were most responsive to the level of those attributes. If for a base case, and I won't get into what that specifically means, but for older farmers, higher payment, in this case, a longer contract, and a larger percent of the cost of seeding the ground paid by government increased likelihood. And if they raised livestock, if the contract didn't change over time, the payment, or if they had to leave their land idle, had a negative influence. Okay, I know that's a lot of information. So this one I think we'll skip for that reason. But the bottom line on this particular project is that it's really important for livestock farmers in particular to be able to graze or hay their land. And so it got us thinking, well, why don't we let them graze or lay their hand? Because if we allow them to hay or graze their land, they're more likely to enroll even at a lower payment. So that would save the government some budget if they were flexible in that regard. If we adjusted the payments scheme so that they were able to adjust the payment midterm. It would increase enrollment, but it would also provide for a great deal of budgetary uncertainty because this is a commitment by the US government to pay. And if they don't know what the land price is going to be 5 years from now, they don't know what that payment is. Rental rate is very important. That wasn't unexpected. And farmers' concerns about the program were important as well. So to us, that meant that alleviating those concerns, either addressing them or better educating farmers about why their concern is not necessarily valid, would increase enrollment. Okay, and then we did it for 5 states as well. That a mail survey, we did a much similar project, but the reason we did it initially was kind of test things. We sent it out for review and we got a lot of feedback that our changes were unrealistic. For example, the USDA, remember we used a payment rate of 80%, 100%, and 120%. Now, the USDA, I could hear the people laughing on the other end. There's no way we're going to increase the payment to 120% of land rental rates. What you looked at is unrealistic. So we reduced the rental rate. We increased the number of years because we're looking at longer term contracts. We changed from allowing haying and grazing, a little more flexibility there after the nesting season, but the farmers had to pay some of the money back if they went ahead and grazed and hayed it, which at the political time was a reality. It was a way to cut budgetary funds. You can go ahead and use the land if you want. It becomes a more flexible and attractive contract, but you have to give us back some of our money. And we also looked at cost share. So very similar findings I'll show you in a minute, but I wanted to step back and see, because some of the questions are pretty important that we asked that weren't in the choice experiment. We did ask them initially in the survey, what is it you look at when you go ahead and apply for or enroll in a contract? And you can see that the most important thing when people enroll in a contract, according to these farmers, was that the payment was guaranteed. It was equally important to the level of the payment. So people that enrolled in the contract, an important part of this long-term contract was that the payment was not going to change. It was like a CD or a long-term government bond where they had that locked in. Other things were important to other people, maintenance requirements, the contract length, and so on. Down here, flexibility and land use, it's less important to people, but that's only because it's only important to one subset, those who need it. Yeah. So in a nutshell, during the second one, landowners preferred shorter contracts like the first one, a higher rental payment and higher cost share, that they could be more flexible, both in land use and in terms of the contract being adjusted, the payment being adjusted midterm. Those who lived on the farm that were older, they had a history of CRP participation and mail were also more likely. And those who grazed livestock or who were enrolled in a working lands program were less likely. Okay, I'm not going to talk. I just want to show you this. This was the results of the second study, and these are the independent variables. These are the variables that we use to explain whether or not a farmer would enroll in a contract. And these are the contract terms right here. And everything else is either describes the farmer or his experiences or the farm. So, and some of the farmer things here are attitudinal things about what they think. So my point here is every one of these is significant, and that's not because it was a huge sample size, because it wasn't, other than these two down here. It means that there's a lot of different factors at play, and estimating a model, trying to estimate whether somebody will enroll in a program and trying to explain that enrollment, that decision-making process, depends a lot on your model. I could have run a model with half of these variables not being here, and we would have gotten a slightly different answer. And so when you're working through these models, literally you have to work through dozens, if not hundreds of them to try to get the best fit. Okay. All right. We already said that. So one thing I do want to note as well, there were a little bit difference between the two models, and that was because I think part of it is we did the interviews here, and we were just, as Craig mentioned earlier, there was a really high price commodity prices here in the early 1910 or 2010s. And we did the interviews here, although we did most of them right here. So things were looking rosy. The CRP was less attractive because crop prices were good. When we got around to the mail survey itself, crop prices had declined significantly. And although there was some optimism that things would go back up, things looked a lot different. There was a lot more risk associated with farming. So the program was a bit more attractive. And my point here is that when you do a survey like this, it really matters what's going on, as Craig said, again, in what's going on in the commodity markets and farm markets and so on. Okay, so are there any questions about that, about the CRP study? I know we're getting close to the end, so I want to address any questions first, and then if there's time, I'll talk about this other program.
I have a question. This is Paige Flynn. I'm curious if what Delta Waterfall is interested in are those locations that tend to be those landowners with livestock more ideal?
I can't hear you so good. You said if Delta Waterfall interested in the locations that tend to be what?
Yeah, are those areas, the livestock owners that have less interest because they're grazers, are those the areas that Delta Waterfowl is more interested in because they're better sites for the waterfowl?
I'm really, you're cutting in and out. Can I'm getting everything except for what the specific area is.
I think she's
probably my computer.
Okay, go ahead, Craig. If you can restate it, that would be.
I think she's saying are the sites that the ranchers aren't interested in roaming, are those sites that are particularly of importance to Delta waterfowl because of certain characteristics?
Okay, that's a great question. So, the whole Prairie Pothole region is of great interest to Delta waterfowl because this is a different program that we won't get to because of time, but as you can see, the way ducks operate, and I was very surprised, is each duck pair, each wetland or low-lying area can only support one duck pair. They're very territorial. So surrounding lands, any lands that are surrounding a low-lying area that contains water during the breeding season are good. So they're in particular interested in, I think they were interested in CRP in general, because in the Prairie Pothole region, there are so many of these water areas. And in order for it to be effective, you can't just have a water area like a pond here with corn growing around it. You need some kind of grassland because they nest. And I know because we have a ice skating rink right outside in a park right outside our house here. And it's they essentially artificially make it. And every year when they drain away the ice pond, a duck pair comes in, and nests there. So if there's crops, if there's areas with CRP or any other grassland, it's very attractive for nesting. So that's their particular objective. So I think the answer is yes. But interestingly, I think as you ask that question, and I'm thinking having land that's grazed by cattle would be equally valuable because it's also land where ducks would nest. The problem with land that's cropped or land that's hayed early is they nest during like late June, early July. And when you're farming, most of the farming activity, the planting and cultivation and so on takes place before that. So there would be no habitat available for them. Does that answer your question?
Maybe Paige could just type in the chat. I asked her if I got that close. There's another question from Dan Syvertson. Is Autobahn Dakota also involved with recruiting in the CRP? And if so, what does a partnership look like? And is it similar to Ducks Unlimited?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, thank you.
And I want to, I'm not going to be able to talk about this working wetlands program, but I do, because of time, but I do want to show you something because I think it gets to that question. And you can look at these slides and I can talk to you about it at some point. But this Delta Waterfall and partners made a working wetlands program that essentially pays farmers not to drain wetlands. But I want to show you, they got this funded by working with partnerships. So it wasn't just Delta Waterfall and say, let's do this. They sat down with the North Dakota Department of Agriculture, the North Dakota Farmers Union, which is on the liberal side, North Dakota Farm Bureau, which is on the conservative side, the Stockmen's Association, that's for livestock, mostly cow-calf people, the grain growers, individual farmers and ranchers, and other government agencies. And they sat down and essentially said, what's important to each group and how can we find commonalities that's important to all of us together. And you can look at that group of people, and if you put Audubon or some other conservation association in there, it's hard pressed to identify where a commonality would occur, because you know, some people want to maximize production on the land and have as much land in production as they can, and others you know, are concerned about protecting the environment and adding more buffer zones and so on. And what they've tried to do is sit down with the whole group of individuals with a vast array of differences. And from the CRP standpoint, you could not really do that. You can't find a commonality with regards to a land retirement program, or at least we could not, that would involve all these individuals. But what they did is with this working wetlands program, they work a working lands program that allows farming to continue. So it allows the grain growers and the Farm Bureau and so on. It allows the farmers to continue to grow. So there's productive activity on the land, but it also has the support of the conservation sort of side of things, because it's doing something to protect a conservation asset. And when you're talking about CRP and other land retirement programs, it's very hard because from the political standpoint, they're opposing naturally. It's not like they're trying to be hard-headed or something. But when you're working in a working lands program, it's a lot easier to gather people around the table and come up with a program. But I'm sorry, I don't know much about Audubon.
Cheryl, just in case you're interested, we have an open session in 2 weeks, and we could continue with the second study if you would like to come back, and maybe we could open up for questions right now. And maybe some folks want to stick around afterward and ask some questions. I have a number for you, but maybe I could open up for questions. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? And just unmute yourself if so. So I guess I have a question about the externalities, right? Which are the water quality, the benefits of pollinators, the benefits of the biodiversity that maybe even farmers might put some marginal value on. Those are probably pretty hard to measure, but I just wonder if any farmers do think about those when they're evaluating their cost benefit ratios, and how if there's a practical way to move those into the benefits category.
So, and that's it's a good question. We did include, and it's more in this study, and I'm happy to come back and talk. It'd be actually interesting to have the individuals that participated in informing. This other program, this working lands program, is an amazing story about politics and moving something through the legislature and getting it in the Farm Bill. But from this standpoint, water quality, one of the attitudinal questions we asked were, how they felt about water quality and when they made decisions and so on. And that showed up as a significant variable in the estimating whether farmers would participate in this wetlands program. So it's really hard to ascertain, as you said, whether or not, how strongly they consider it and so on, because we always, as economists, assume that they're just, trying to maximize production. I think you'll find farmers, and there's been a lot of work in that area, are a lot of them are conservationist in as much as they can be. So, obviously it's a preference to do something that's good for the environment. We don't see so many tree lines and large buffer zones and so on, just because it's not economically viable for somebody that doesn't already have the wealth. In other words, they don't own the farm, like a new farmer or rancher and so on. And a lot of these working lands programs are making things like that possible. My personal interaction with farmers over the last few decades, and I probably your own as well, is most farmers care a lot about the environment and water quality and soil quality and so on, not just from a general good standpoint, but because it has an important impact on their own soil productivity and so on. We did try to include it by including attitudinal changes, and we can estimate how it changes willingness to enroll in a program, what their attitudes are about water quality and so on. I did not try to monetarize it. I did not try to say, I think the way to do it, Craig, and it would be something you could pretty easily do if you ask the right questions, is, what is the trade-off between water quality and the payment? Would you take a payment that's only 95% of the land rental rate if this practice were demonstrated to improve water quality? So you could certainly do it. You would just need to ask the right questions. But the interesting thing about that is people tend to overestimate their maybe their how much they value something. That's more kind of a vague concept. It's very, I don't know. I tell you a story. Moorhead went to this single sort recycling, and if you ask me, do I care about recycling and the environment and so on, I would have said sure. But I had no idea how much my own personal behavior depended on it being convenient. Because now we have single sort recycling. We just throw stuff out in that big old bin. We don't have to separate it and so on. And I became an environmentalist from a recycling standpoint, simply by convenience. And that's, I'm embarrassed to say that. So I think farmers would, it's hard even for an individual to estimate what the value is of particular things that are inherently good for, like, the environment. That's a long question answer.
Yeah,
sorry.
That's interesting. I have one more question, but I want to wait a second. Does anybody have a question you want to put in chat or unmute yourself, please? So from a conservation biologist perspective, the fact that there's flexibility in the length of the contract actually, to me, almost seems like a bad thing, right? That it would almost be better to pay the farmers more and have more long-term benefits, right? Because if you have a piece of land going in and out, the actual accrued benefits in terms of the environmental benefits, I don't think they ever get optimized, right? And so, that's why I asked about tying it to the market, right? Because if you could set the price some well above the median or something, and maybe, on average, farmers are getting more than they would on average across time, and that was clear to them, maybe they'd be willing to enroll for 10, 20 years. Because seeing all those unenrollments back in the late, about 10 years ago, it was just heartbreaking to people like me to drive out to the areas we'd seen were wide open and good habitat, and all of a sudden they're soybeans.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a political question, and I think, I don't know if North Dakota is the only state, but it's one of the only state that does not allow permanent easements. So, for example, the answer, of course, is to get an easement, like a wildlife, the Fish and Wildlife Service to get an easement on, or somebody to get a permanent easement on the land. And it's hard to come across and sit down with farmers and talk about these things without them talking about, the back 40 where their grandfather gave somebody an easement on the property, and how they're still paying taxes on it, but it's of no value from a production standpoint, and so on. I think naturally people are hesitant to enroll their land for a long period of time, but if you could make it market based, it would of course be very attractive, but I can't see that being politically terribly easy to pass in a political standpoint because of the uncertainty associated with the cash outlay.